If you ever feel like life's happening too fast and you've got no time to cry, you're in the right place. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of No Time to Cry. It's been a long week, guys, since the last episode came out. I've been in Dubai, I've been living my best life, I've managed to catch some sort of plague whilst I was over there on the plane and traveling. I did a lot of traveling. So I apologise in advance for the snivels and for the potential coughs. I will do my best to edit as much of that out as possible so you don't have to listen to it. I've tried to postpone recording the podcast as late as I possibly can, just purely so you don't have to listen to the intense vibes. I probably look slightly better than I feel. I've tried to glamorize myself a little bit. The cap is hiding a multitude of sins in terms of my I'm just not feeling very well today. So I'm going to try and really kind of push through and get the episode recorded as much as possible, but apologies if I'm not 100% myself, but next week I should be feeling a lot better. We can do another episode that's hopefully doesn't involve me kind of snotting around or coughing throughout. But I have really, really enjoyed hearing a lot from you guys on the back of my vision board episode. And there was quite a few people that have listened to that episode that have never listened to the podcast before. And I feel like this is a really good opportunity for me to do a bit of a reintroduction of who I am, but also where this podcast originated from, because we've still got a lot of listeners that joined that started off when it was Laura and I sat in multiple different rooms recording the podcast. And I want to bring us back to our roots a little bit and make sure that people understand what was the point of the podcast in the first place. Yes, it's evolved, yes, it's changed, but I'm never going to forget why we did this and what the purpose was. But on top of that, I want people to understand a little bit more about me, who I am, why I do what I do, why I do this podcast, why I choose to regularly admit to things on the internet that should probably stay private. But there you go. That's me. That's who I am. And yeah, so I feel like this is a bit of a nice episode. I can give you a bit of a recap. I love Dubai. I had the best time. My grandma, and I'm going to say Nan because she hates me calling her grandma, she had the best 70th ever. And if you've not seen the clip on my social media of me going to surprise her in the hotel, please go and watch it. I've watched it thousands of times. It literally warms my heart up. I have never met a woman that's so grateful to just like, one, be taken away on a trip for her 70th, and a big, shout out to Sean, for my auntie, for organising that. But also she just is vibes. Like, I'm going to post a video of her. If you're on my personal social media, you would have seen it. But she was like in this Greek restaurant on her 70th birthday, like up dancing on the chairs and tables. And if that isn't how I spend my 70th birthday, I've mucked this up, because that is the life I want to live. She just had the best time. So I've come back. Obviously, I've told you I'm ill. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm going to try and ignore it. My head's been a bit clouded this week on what to talk about. And because I have had so many kind of new listeners reach out who are on a similar vibe in terms of the vision board and wanting to change their life, I was like, let me just reintroduce myself. And for the ones that have been around for a while or know me really, really well and are maybe friends, family, or I've worked with you over the years, You probably know a lot of this already, but I'm in a different place in my life now. So, how I tell my story and how I talk about myself will always be a little bit different. So, buckle in, let's get started. So, yeah, if you now know me because I've been swanning around in Dubai and posting vision board posts, that is a little bit different to who I am in general as a person, or who I have been over the last few years. So I am 29. I am from London, but I've lived in the northwest of England for be coming up to 10 years this year, I think, roughly about 10 years. And I moved up north when I met my partner in London, who's from the northwest. And, you know, it's cheaper to live up here than it is in London. But also, he has a son. So my stepson, Vaughan, he is turning 17 this year, and he's been in my life since he was 5. So that's a big part of kind of who I am. And then my little family, really, guys, like they mean the absolute world to me. And obviously, living in the Northwest when all of my family, in terms of my mum, my sister, my nan, etc., still live in London, it was really important for me to kind of have that family unit. But also, I've built my own family in terms of like my friends, the people that I've met over the years that have become just like a really stable part of my life, whether that be in work or, you know, through Jamie and through his friendships and things like that. But I'm a corporate girly. I've worked in corporate since I was 18, pretty much. That's where I met Jamie. And the podcast kind of came out of something that really just shook my world upside down, as it did Laura's at the time. So 3 years ago, or 3.5, coming up to 3.5 years ago for Laura. If you've never heard of Laura before, she is one of my best friends who I used to record this podcast with. And 3.5 years ago, unfortunately, Laura lost her mum really suddenly to a heart attack. And you can go back and listen to episode 2, which explains Laura's story. And episode 3 is my story, and you can go back and listen to that. And I'm not going to go into as much detail on that exactly today, but I'm going to give you an updated version on kind of what's gone on and where I'm up to today. So if you want to listen to a bit more grit of what was going on in that time, you can listen back to that, because that will be coming up to 2 years ago now, and I was in a complete different headspace to where I am now. So it's interesting even for me to listen to that back and kind of see what I was speaking about at the time and how I was feeling, because it has changed. So yeah, Laura lost her mum really suddenly, really, really unfortunate. It was a massive shock. Laura was one of my best friends who I met at a workplace, and we'd both left that workplace, but you know, Laura will always be a big part of my life. We are proper soul sisters. When you meet someone, you kind of know. I always say that with my friends. Like, I always know when my friends are going to be a part of my life forever, because I think you get that kind of similar connection of when you meet the love of your life as well. Like, you love these people, right? And you gain those connections. And I spent kind of 4 months exactly, you know, just being a big support to Laura. And then exactly 4 months to the day, unfortunately, I lost my dad. And that was also a really big surprise. Unfortunately, my dad took his own life, so it was suicide. So, two really both shocking events for both of us, losing a parent in a really, I don't know, they're so different, but they're so similar, because you have to get through the shock of losing someone before you start grieving them. And although we lost those parents in different ways, they kind of evoke similar emotions in terms of how you feel in that situation, or how you at least process things. I do think we had a different experience of grief, but in a lot of ways it was very, very similar. So about a year and a half, maybe coming up to 2 years for Laura, I had a dream where Laura and I had started a podcast talking about grief, and I messaged Laura about it. And we decided, you know what? Fuck it, let's do it. Like, what harm can it do? And we started No Time to Cry, and that's where it came from. And it was very much a podcast driven about our grief story and grief and the ability for Laura and I to be there for each other during grief. But actually, we know a lot of people don't have that. A lot of people don't have somebody, by their side that, again, it's different, but in very similar ways. We understood exactly what each other was going through, but also at the same time, 4 months between us. Whereas if one of my friends lost a parent now, suddenly I would be there for them, but I am 3 years along now. So trying to bring yourself back to that place that you're in when you first lose a parent, I'll be honest, it would be tricky for me, I think, because I don't know if I could completely recall that period of time and where my head was at, because I do think I was very much in a state of shock. So I don't know how much I was really registering what my thoughts and feelings were. Whereas for Laura, she had just gone through that with her mum, was still going through it. 4 months is a really, really short period of time. And we were able to kind of lean on each other, as well as understanding that we were quite big triggers for each other as well, in terms of if I was in a bad place with my grief, I didn't always lean on Laura at that time if she was also struggling, because it could have just been an absolute shit show. So that's where the podcast came from. And I think it's really important for our listeners, especially that are here kind of listening to this episode today, to understand where the roots of this came from, because it has expanded now. This is my 4th episode back. Obviously, if you listen to the first episode, you'll understand why I'm by myself and Lauren's not with me. We're still kind of keeping some hope in there that she'll come back eventually. But I will talk about grief on episodes. It's not going to be the whole topic of what this podcast is about, because my life isn't just about grief. At that time, I'll be honest, my life was probably 90% about grief. I was still very deep a year after losing a parent in such a sudden way, or regardless of how you lose that parent, it kind of takes over your life. And it's still a huge part of my life. I think about my dad every single day. Like, there's not a single day that's passed since I lost my dad that I don't think about him. So it is going to come up in conversation. And I think it's really important for me to kind of acknowledge that, because if you joined us back when we first created the podcast and you wanted to hear about the grief and you wanted to hear about our experiences of grief, I don't want you to think now listening to this podcast that, I've come so far away from it and I'm not going to cover those topics. I will always speak about grief. It's one of the things I talk about really openly in my life, because there was parts of the last 3 years where I haven't really had it in me to block it out. I think in the last year I've done a lot of blocking. Possibly why I left the podcast for so long, if I'm being completely honest. I think moving house and planning a wedding when a parent is not going to be there, it triggers a lot of emotions around grief. And if I'm reflecting on some of the reasons why maybe I didn't want to record or I didn't want to pick the podcast back up, obviously I was feeling overwhelmed at the time and there was loads of things going on. But actually, I think it would have meant me touching a place kind of emotionally that I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to go there. And now I've put some of those stuff down, and obviously we're not decorating in the house and stuff at the moment. I feel like, and I spoke to my therapist about this, that I'm kind of ready to pick it back up and have a little bit of a talk about grief again. And I don't want to hold it in such a way for my whole entire life that it becomes a problem for me. I really sat with my grief in the first year. I did the really ugly side of grief. I didn't throw myself straight back into work. I had a month off work. I didn't avoid the conversations. I spoke about my dad. I started a fucking podcast about grief within the first year of losing my dad, which is pretty crazy when I think about it. So yeah, I wasn't afraid of those conversations, and I think that is a big part of my personality. And I've got such a dark sense of humor. Like, any of my friends will tell you, if anyone's gonna joke about the loss of like losing a parent and how it impacts you and kind of laugh through the pain, that's me. That is how I deal with it. And that's kind of what I want to carry forward in terms of the episodes as well. And I have got a box of tissues here. One, because I have got a cold, but two, because when I talk about my dad, I do get quite emotional. And that says to me, like, there is still a lot of stuff that I'm holding on to. And funny enough, I posted on my Instagram about it a few weeks ago when I was starting the podcast. I've been going to a spiritualist church with one of my good friends, Nick. And one of the first times we went to the spiritualist church, this gentleman brought my dad through, and he was talking to me about my dad and, all those kind of details. And he said to me, "Your dad is saying to you, your heart is broken into 1,000 different pieces. And you really need to get a big roll of fucking sellotape back out and try and stick it back together again. And it's going to take a lot of work, but you've got to try and mend it." And it really hit home for me. I cried obviously when I was in there, but I cried when I came home and I spoke to Jamie, because I do feel like a big part of why I maybe felt slightly emotionally detached last year, or withdrawn, or just not present, was because I was pretending that I wasn't sad anymore, if I'm honest. Pretending that I wasn't sad all the time, pretending that I wasn't missing my dad all the time. And there's some really complex, like big complexities around my relationship with my dad, which, absolutely go back to episode 2 and listen to, because that's a long episode and I go into it in a lot of detail. But there was a lot of things in terms of like mental health with my dad, and alcoholism, and, drug abuse over the years, and things like that. And me having to take a break away from my dad prior to him passing away, just because for my own mental health and where I was at that time. And there's layers to it. And those layers kind of make who you are as a person. And you do hold on to those layers, and they come out in very different ways. And I think over the last 3 years, and it's literally 3 years and like 1 month since I lost my dad, I have become a completely different person to who I was prior to him passing away. And there's big parts of that who I am really, really proud of. I've created something with this podcast, but also in work and some of the volunteering roles that I do, that allow me to help and support other people who are struggling, and talk about some of this stuff that nobody wants to talk about. Or if they want to talk about it, they want to talk about it with a very specific lens. They don't want to get into the crappy sides of it and the really kind of dark sides and the personal sides. Whereas, I'll be honest, I'll talk about it. If I'm going to talk about my relationship with my dad, I'm going to be honest about it. It wasn't all smiles. It wasn't this really perfect relationship where I lost him and, he did everything for me and he was this perfect dad. That wasn't our story. It doesn't mean that when I lost him, I don't miss him any less, and I don't miss the opportunity of the kind of reconciliation of the relationship, or also just maybe miss the dad that I kind of maybe feel like I need at this point, which wouldn't have necessarily been my dad. But that doesn't mean that I can't miss that figure, and I can't miss that kind of support network that maybe I've felt like I've needed. But it has allowed me to create this part of my personality where I can give back because of the experiences that I've had. And if that helps one or two people, you know, even, and I've had a surprising amount of people message me since I brought the podcast back, whether that be that they're caring for a loved one or they are struggling with endometriosis and it's impacted their life loads. And that's a story I'm going to come back to for someone who reached out to me after the hormones episode. Or maybe they've not had friendships growing up and they're trying to create a new space where they feel supported. Like, all of these messages, I read every single one and I reply to all of them, because a lot of these people are strangers who I've never met, who have just come across my podcast. And we're not talking about thousands of people listening to my podcast every week. It's, 100, 200. But that is massive for me, because if I say even a minute or 2 minutes in each podcast that allow someone to come away and think, do you know what? It's so fucking normal that I feel like that. Or I'm glad I'm not the only person that feels like they want to change their life this year. Or I'm glad I'm not the only person who has a hair growing out of their chin. Or I'm glad I'm not the only person who lost their parent suddenly and is 3 years on and still struggling with it, or 10 years on and still struggling with it. So yeah, I want this podcast to be a supportive, like, space where I can talk about anything, because being an adult, your life touches everything. And like I said on episode 1, some people were a bit like, "Oh god, that's so morbid," when we first brought this podcast out. But actually, Laura and I received so many messages about the experience that people had with loss, whether that be friends, grandparents, parents, children. And it really marked a part of my heart. It's created this space in me that's become even more empathetic to people's situations and what people are going through. And it's made me a better person. So why wouldn't I still talk about that? And why wouldn't that be a topic for the podcast? And unfortunately, as we all get older, it's going to become part of all of our lives. And grief isn't just about death. It might be that you're grieving the version of the person that you were previously. It might be you're grieving the end of a relationship, a friendship. Laura and I spoke so much about kind of grief in friendships and what that does to people, and how much you think about those people that are no longer in your life because they've chosen to be, or you've chosen not to be. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of do a bit of a recap and maybe just set a little bit of tone for people that are joining and saying, like, this is where it came from. You'll hear these topics come up. It's not going to be every week. I'm not going to talk about it every week. But if it comes up every week, then I will talk about it. It just depends where my life is. This podcast is an opportunity. This is like my diary, my journal. And certainly as I get kind of closer to wedding planning and what's happening and where are we going with that, it's something that is on my mind more often, because I'm not going to have my dad on my wedding. That's sad for me. And there's a big part of me that kind of, because our relationship was turbulent, wouldn't have necessarily had that anyway. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't impact me thinking about the fact that he won't be there. And I saw, it's not the TikTok of the week, but I saw this post the other day, and my friend Nicola sent it to me because she's got such a similar, Nick's got such a similar sense of humor as me, which I think is why we've kind of bonded so much, but why we enjoy going to the spiritualist church. And it was this Instagram post, and it was this guy, and I'll find his name afterwards, kind of sat there. It was like, things I feel like is selfish that my mum, that my mum's done since she's died. It's like, she said she was going to retire and look after my kids 2 days a week. Well, now she's dead. So that's like really selfish. She's not going to be at my wedding. She doesn't come and do this for me. And it's like such a funny take on what grief is. And I have such a kind of similar, thought process where I joke about stuff like that. And I'm like, oh God, little bastard. Like, it's not even going to be my wedding. Like, what the fuck? Like, how unfair is that you're not going to be there? And it's not about feeling sorry for yourself, because we all experience kind of different sorts of loss and grief, and there's thousands and millions of people that haven't had their family at their wedding, either because the relationship's not there or because they've passed away. But I'm entitled to kind of sit there and go, "Do you know what? It's quite shit that he's not going to be there." In an ideal world, would I have had a dad that was there, that was kind of like sober and clean and able to enjoy my wedding day with me? Absolutely. That would have been ideal, the goal. It's not gonna be my wedding, that's not gonna be the story for my wedding day, but I know that I'm gonna have an incredible day anyway. So it's just kind of making space for those emotions over the next couple of months. And it is gonna be something that I'll talk about. And I think planning a wedding, knowing that you're not gonna have a parent there, is a slightly different experience. It's making sure that certain suppliers know, so they're not going, "Oh, do you want a picture of your dad?" or "Are you going to do a daughter father dance?" and all those kind of things. I'm trying to kind of protect my peace on the day by trying to be organized ahead of time. But yeah, I think the other thing that I always think about with kind of grief is like when you've got any sort of life events. So even the stuff going on with work, those thoughts and feelings around whether, am I going to start my own business? Am I going to do this? Am I going to do that? And I talk about that grief in a very kind of open way, because again, it's not necessarily that my dad would have had all of the answers. So potentially sometimes the grief that I feel is for the absence of that kind of person that's able to give me advice in my life. And Jamie's great. Obviously, he runs his own business, so I've got him there. But I think a partner is so different to like a parental figure in a lot of ways. And anyone that's in therapy, and I've spoke to my therapist about this in terms of, do I sometimes use my therapist as like a parental soundboard, because it's I think when you grow up in a certain kind of way, in the kind of household that I did with all the stuff going on with my dad, the relationship that you have with your parents is slightly different. And that's no discredit to my mom and how she brought us up or anything like that. She does also listen to this podcast. But it just means that your relationships are different. And my relationship with my dad, even when it was good, was different, because you grow up quickly when you grow up in a household that has an individual that struggles with kind of their mental health and alcohol, which means that sometimes you become a parental figure to that parent. So I don't necessarily feel like I've always had that kind of, especially from like a dad is going, "Oh, you know, I'll speak to my dad about that," or "I've got that some person who I can call and ask for advice." He was great at like anything manual labor, anything going on in the house, those kind of like roles. But also, there was lots of other things that I would have never spoke to my dad about, just because of his mental health and his own headspace. So yeah, it's an odd one. My therapy journey's been like a bit of a kind of working out what I'm using it for as well. And sometimes it is a soundboard, and sometimes I know what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, and I'm just kind of going, does that make sense? And hearing it back. But certainly around this work stuff, like I feel like it's great. I've got great opportunities kind of coming forward for me at the moment, but you don't always know. I suppose there's that panic around, am I making the right choices in my life? I've got good opportunities, but maybe one of them is better than another. Yeah, I mean, I've got plenty of friends that I can speak to about, plenty of like, family that I can talk about. My family are they won't mind me saying this, they're a working class family. So there's not a huge amount of experience like in the corporate world either, or of starting their own businesses and things like that. So it's just trying to find that kind of, and creating that network of people around you where you feel supported regardless of what you're talking about. And I think a big part of my vision board this year was about expanding my network, and not necessarily from like a friend's perspective, albeit like you can always have more friends, right? But maybe from more of a career network kind of place, because I think I'm in a different space of my career than maybe I was a few years ago. So I suppose I'm kind of waffling a little bit, but I think grief kind of touches every aspect of your life, even when you don't realize it. No matter what you're doing and being an adult in, whether that be having kids or choosing not to have kids, or your career, or going on holidays, doing new experiences, getting married, buying a house, whatever the fuck you're doing next, because we're always doing something. It kind of just trips you up every turn that you do, and you almost come to expect it and think about it a bit more, because I don't know, better the devil you know. Like, sometimes it's better to address those kind of thoughts and feelings up front rather than letting them sideswipe you. So yeah, I'm in a where am I with my grief? I suppose I'm maybe readdressing some of it, trying to get past some of the bits I'm hanging on to maybe too much that aren't doing me justice. And you certainly go through kind of periods with your grief where you go, I just can't think about it right now. Like, I just need to pretend that he's not dead and, whatever. And I've had some really kind of funny dreams over the last couple of months where actually I've had some dreams that he's still alive and stuff like that. And I made a comment to my therapist. She's so good, by the way. You'll see her comment on some of my stuff sometimes when I make jokes about therapy. That, my mind is, what a horrible thing for my mind to do, to like have a dream that my dad's still alive and then have to wake up and go back through that. And she's like, Shannon, your mind isn't a separate entity. That's you. Maybe you should listen to it. If there is a part of you that's sat there, like, that's your unconscious saying to you, stop pretending. And maybe you need to readdress and sit with it a little bit, that you're still sad that your dad's dead. Like, that's not your mind. You can't think about your mind as this completely different place. Like, that's your mind. Even if it's your unconscious mind, it's trying to bring something to your conscious for you to address and talk about. So this podcast used to be a really good place for me to kind of, I suppose, talk about my grief and how it was impacting me. And I still want that to be what this place is, as well as me being able to talk about just everything that we go through. So that's kind of why it pivoted, because I feel like grief wasn't all of my life. And it's hard to come every week and just talk about grief, because your life is so much bigger than that. And although that your grief kind of impacts your everyday life, I don't think any one of us that have lost somebody wants grief to be the entirety of our lives. You want to be able to move with your life, albeit you're still carrying your grief. And some days are easier than others, but you don't want to circle your life around that kind of being the entirety. Hence why we shifted and we moved. But like I say, I'll always kind of talk about it a little bit, because that's just part of who I am. And grief in the year of the 2026, albeit I want to have a good year, I think some of that year is going to be addressing some of the issues around grief, including, how the next couple of months or the first 6 months of this year, when I'm doing some really big things and marrying the love of my life and stuff like that, I'm going to have to address probably some big feelings around it. Because although it will be the happiest day of my life, there'll probably be some really sad elements to it as well. So come along for the ride. Hear me cry probably at some point about how crap it is. But no, I'm looking forward to this year. I feel like this year's going to be a good year for most of us. And I say most of us because for some of us it won't be, but it feels like things are shifting in positive ways. And I mentioned it on the previous episode, the world is an ugly, horrible place at the moment. And I think if we can all think about individually how we play into making it a better place and having good experiences for ourselves, but those people and things around us that we have in control of, then I can't think of the sayings, but butterfly effect, small positive changes have bigger effects than you anticipate. And that's what I'm trying to do, I suppose, in terms of thinking about what my next career move is, thinking about the pod, thinking about what I'm going to talk about. And I love to hear from you. Subscribe, follow us, but also don't be afraid to give me ideas and things you want to hear me talk about. I could talk the hind legs off a donkey about most things. I could clearly talk to myself because, I've sat here for however many minutes nattering away. I like to pretend you guys are on the other side of the phone anyway, so it makes it easier for me to be more honest about things, feeling like you're my kind of expanded friendship group and I can natter away. Bit of a life update, I suppose. Life update, grief update, podcast update, introduction. I'm going to try and Jamie listens to my podcast every week, by the way. He's like my biggest fan. I'd like him to kind of play into an episode at some point in terms of, we planned it when Laura and I were doing an episode. Obviously, we were recording together about maybe getting a side of grief from like a partner or something like that. And I would love to hear from him at some point. So maybe if I say it in this field and I say it on the podcast, I'm not going to tell him I've said it. I'm going to let him come across it on an episode that I can get him to record, even just kind of a small section in kind of the experience of supporting me through a lot of this stuff in the last few years, because he's incredible. Like, I'm his biggest fan as much as he's my biggest fan. And I wouldn't have done anything in the last kind of 3 years without his support and how he's been there for me and stuff like that. And I suppose that's why I'm marrying him. I mean, it'd be a bloody crap decision if it wasn't. But I come back to something I heard, and I mentioned it on a podcast episode a long time ago, and it's coming up anyway because I'm going to do a TikTok of the week in a second. But there was a TikTok of this woman speaking to her kid and her kid's friends and said, don't worry about what everyone looks like because looks fade. Don't worry about, what job they have or what they do, because again, those things come and go. Marry the person that will hold your hand and get you through the grief of losing a parent, because that is the person you need in your life forever. And that is my James. So, yeah, I would love to hear his kind of take on it. We talk about things like that quite a lot, but it'd be good to kind of hear his side of what he kind of thinks in terms of how it's been and how it's changed over the last 3 years, because there were certainly times where I've been more open about it and when I've been more closed. So that's that. Anyway, should we move on to the TikTok of the week? It is about grief, but it's a funny one. So I came across this TikTok actually a while ago, and I think it was Laura that sent it to me. And it came back up on my FYP this week. And I thought, you know what? It's so funny. I've got to talk about it. And it's from a creator called Bucket List Boy Shade. And I'll tag his page as I always do on the episode if you're watching on YouTube. And it's a really, really funny video of him and his sister sat in the car and they're talking about the things his niece and her daughter said, I think she was like 5 or something like that, when her mum first died, and just how hilarious it was. And this is my sense of humour through and through. So she was like, the day her mum died, like obviously she'd spent a lot of time on her own and her partner had kept the kids away from her a little bit, and her daughter came upstairs and like walked into her bedroom. She was like, "Hiya, mum." Hi. She's like, are you still sad that Nanny died? It was literally the same 24 hours that she was dead, but they're pissing themselves. And then she was like, I'll cheer you up. And she sang her this song that was like, I'm sorry, your mum's dead and you can't visit people. And it's just hilarious. And the comments were equally as hilarious. And I'm going to read a couple of the comments to you because I just honestly, it had me in stitches. And I spent so long on the TikTok, like it was just playing and playing in the background, just pissing myself at the comments. So one of them says, my dad passed at my house. He had gotten unwell and I didn't want him to be home alone, but we only had two beds. So he went into my daughter's room. Less than 12 hours after he passed, she said, at least I get my room back. And she said the police came to verify the death as the ambulance service was so busy. And as she saw them walking to the front door, she turned to me and said, ooh, they think you murdered him. She was 7. So funny because I feel like kids have such an unfiltered like tone when you talk about death, and it's just so, for a lot of people, although that would have been difficult, it just gives you something to laugh about. And when you're in the pits of hell of grief, as I like to call it, like these little moments where you just you've got to laugh, otherwise you're gonna carry, like, you'll never stop crying. It's bloody brilliant. I'm going to read this one next. So, literal hours after our grandma died, my dad obviously wasn't himself, and my special needs sister shouted at him and said, hey, just because your mum died doesn't mean you can have an attitude with me. And I love that again because it's just hilarious. Like, it's so funny. What else was there? Oh, God, no, that's funny. So she said, at my daughter's funeral, there was a moment of reflection and everybody was silent. And in the distance, you can hear an ice cream van. And my 4-year-old son loudly shouts, Mum, can I have an ice cream? In the middle of this kind of like moment of reflection and like silence, and his daughter, like his sister's obviously just passed away, but I just, for some people they'll be like, wow, that's so dark, but I just think it's so funny. Like, there is so much light in these situations as well, and you've got to kind of find it. You've got to, because if you don't, it's like it's such a dark place that you can be in. For my thought of the week, actually, I was thinking about it knowing that I was going to talk about this TikTok. And the thought of the week is, it's okay to find light and jokes, if that's what you want to call it, in some of the like heaviest and darkest situations, because sometimes that's all that you've got to get you through. So that's my thought of the week. Sometimes we can find light. Give yourself permission to find some of that kind of lightheartedness in those jokey situations. And I think you've got to find the balance, right? Like, if you're a friend and you're supporting someone that's going through someone, let them lead with it. Don't lead with the jokes too soon. But if that's their character, kind of see where their head's at. It might help. So yeah, thought of the week, episode of the week. It's been a different one. We've done 4 very different episodes. And I'm hoping it'll continue to kind of go that way, where we'll just talk about different things. And it's very much led by kind of what's going on in my life at the moment. But like I've said, definitely send me some ideas. I'm going to give you some updates next week, actually, on some of the health stuff going on. I've had my blood test back and those kind of things, so we can have a little bit of an update session. Hopefully you would have all caught up on the episodes around hormones and vision boards and all those sorts of things. And then you'll be ready for a little update. And if, like I said, if you want to hear a little bit more about kind of my story, how I lost my dad in a bit more detail, and I do go into detail of kind of the exact experience of the day that I lost him and the months leading up after it, go back and listen to episode 3, I think it would have been called at the time, Shannon's story. it's raw, it's quite emotional, to be honest. And I have listened to it back since. I don't feel like I need to go back over that in today's episode. It was more about just kind of giving you an idea of where this whole thing came from. But, that is my story. And my story will continue to change over the next few years, but it will forever be kind of in the depths of like, yeah, I did lose my dad to suicide, and that's a really big deal. It's not easy for everyone to hear and listen, but that's kind of my life. That was my dad's choice. That was his decision. I respect his choices. I respect his decision. That's how I've dealt with my grief. I don't feel the same way about suicide as a lot of people do in terms of the emotions attached to it. And I talk a lot about that in that episode, and I still feel that way. So, as much as I've progressed and I've changed in the last 3 years, also a lot of my views on kind of my experience at that time was still very similar. So, if you want me to talk a little bit more about it, I'm happy to do so. If not, we'll kind of pick up on it as and when it kind of impacts me and I want to talk about it and I want to lean into it. I would love to do an episode on a little bit more about the spiritualist church, because that's been really interesting and something I've been doing just before the end of last year, and kind of regularly going with myself and Nick's mum. And it's just been a real experience. But I also like hearing other people's stories and their experiences, and hearing from friends and people that kind of you come across in life. It's not always your loved ones that come through, actually, which is super interesting. Sometimes it's just people needing to pass a message over, maybe even for someone else. So maybe I'll do a little bit around that in kind of a future episode, and how I found that and what's gone on, and some of the kind of experiences that I've had in the spiritualist church, which have been crazy. And hopefully I'll have some more. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe, like, comment on the videos. It really helps. If you're listening on Spotify, again, subscribe, like the episode, repost for us. We'd love to get some more listeners in. I'd love to broaden my horizons. Let's see how many people we can get listening to it. But also, I like my little community, and I had a conversation with someone who reached out to me last week, who just complete random found me on YouTube and was like, oh, I'm really inspired by what you're doing. How do you kind of get past the like just post random stuff and not worry about whether people like it or not? And I just said, the way that I view the numbers is, if like episode 1, when I came back, over 200 people have listened to that episode. If someone asked me to talk in front of 200 people at work, that would be a really big deal for me. I've done it. It's scary. I enjoy it, but it's scary. And that's how I think about it. So if I'm posting a video on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and hundreds or thousands of people in some cases are viewing those videos, like, that's a really big deal. I don't care if it's not hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Yeah, it would be great, if things blew up. But actually, I have respect for the people that come and listen every week, and those 60, 70, whatever it is, people on YouTube that consistently watch. Like, love you guys. Thank you so much for engaging with me. And thank you so much for watching and listening every week. Especially now it's just me kind of muttering on my own. But I'm enjoying it, and it's not a chore, and I like it. And I've really enjoyed what we've created so far, certainly since I've come back. And many more to come. See you all soon.